in July, we're doing a review of the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, as well as looking at the proposed 8th principle. And so to recap, last Sunday we discussed how the 7 principles are not statements of belief, but serve as a series of commitments. They form the covenant that binds together UU congregations within the Unitarian Universalist Association. Since they are a compelling statement of who we are and how we want to be in the world, many individual Unitarian Universalists have also adopted them as their own personal commitment. And taken together, the principles give us the grounding, method, and a meaning of Unitarian Universalism. The 1st and 7th principles, the outside principles, form the theological grounding for Unitarian Universalism, affirming the inherent worth and dignity of each person and respect for the interdependent web of existence. And taken together, inherent worth and dignity and interdependence, these constitute what the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt calls a love ethic that says each person deserves to be held in care alongside creation, and that, in the words of the Reverend Teresa Soto, all of us need all of us to make it. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th principles, the inside principles, give us the method of Unitarian Universalism, our way of being religious together. And the method is freedom. We believe in freedom of thought and expression, acceptance of one another, encouragement to spiritual growth, and democratic principles. We believe our theological diversity is a strength that contributes to the richness of our community. That leaves the 2nd and 6th principles, which John has kindly named for us in his reflection: justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, and the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. The 2nd principle is about how we should behave with one another as individuals. The 6th principle is about our vision for the world, the goal we are working towards in history. I like to think of it as the Star Trek principle, because it is the vision of the future that Gene Roddenberry gave us in the original Star Trek series, a world where humanity had resolved its struggles with racism, poverty, and war, and turned to wonder, exploration, and the advancement of knowledge as the highest expression of the human spirit. The 2nd and 6th principle together give a meaning for Unitarian Universalism, which I will state this way. Our religious tradition is about lives transformed by service and moved by compassion to make love real in the world. Now notice I don't say this is the meaning of Unitarian Universalism. Religious traditions and religious institutions are complex, multifaceted entities that have multiple meanings in the world and in people's lives. There is not one meaning to Unitarian Universalism, but it is a meaning of Unitarian Universalism, and it is a meaning that is powerfully attested to again and again in our history. We understand love as calling us to work for justice in the world. We believe that we cannot be free until all are free, that we cannot be whole until all are whole, that ultimately no one should be left outside the circle of care and human kindness. And yet, the world that confronts us is so different than the one we long for, the world we dream of. Parker Palmer calls this the tragic gap. And time and again, Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists have stepped into that painful gap and said, I cannot do everything, but let me do what I can. Let me do the work it is given to me to do. Our lives of service often start with a personal encounter with pain or need, and with our own compassionate response. This is the galvanizing moment. We get proximate with people's pain, as Brian Stevenson says. This could be our own pain or need. And then love calls us to respond. And where there is persistent pain, there is often also injustice. Not always, but often. And so getting proximate to pain can lead us to encounter systems of injustice, exploitation, or simple neglect and indifference. Our love then calls us to organize a greater response, to fight the injustice, to remedy the neglect, to awaken hearts and minds. This is justice work. Cornel West says justice is what love looks like in public. Now, there are many examples of UUs living this out in history. As I have mentioned before, you can scarcely name a progressive movement in American history where you will not find the deep involvement of Unitarians and Universalists. Dorothea Dix is just one famous example. She was a Unitarian woman who got proximate with people in prisons and mental institutions in the 1840s and began writing scathing reports exposing the terrible conditions she witnessed. From her individual compassion, she organized a systemic response, educating people and getting reform laws passed. And she was instrumental in founding the first mental hospital in the country. Well, I'd like to share a less well-known example of a Unitarian Universalist minister named Orloff Miller. And some of this information comes from the book Sacred Service in Civic Space by Kathleen Parker, and some from the book Selma by the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed. Orloff Miller was one of many Unitarian Universalist ministers who answered Dr. King's call for white ministers to go to Selma and support the civil rights action there. Prior to going to Selma, Miller was part of a contingent of UUs who toured Mississippi, familiarizing themselves with the situation on the ground there. This was part of his work with the UUA. They covered 902 miles and talked to 100 key organizers and activists. And they recommended in the report that they sent back that UUs get more involved in Alabama. This was an extremely dangerous thing to do. Just a week earlier, a young black man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, had been shot and killed by a police officer during a protest there. Miller advised Unitarian ministers, don't go to Selma unless it's more important to you that you go there than that you come back. UUs went. More than 60 ministers representing 10% of our active ministry at the time. And in the brief time that Miller was there, the Reverend James Reeb was killed in the streets, and a young UU woman named Viola Liuzzo was shot and killed in her car by the KKK while she was driving black people to the polls to vote. Miller himself was with James Reeb during the attack, and he was beaten as well. Miller later said of his time in Selma, I've been asked many times what business white clergy had in Selma, Alabama. What right did we have telling folks how they should run their lives? We not only had a right, we had a responsibility to be there because some of our family, our black brothers and sisters, were not being treated fairly. And wherever people are not being given their fair shot at having a full and meaningful life, we have a responsibility to do what we can to help change that. He concludes, if it means we have to argue with other brothers and sisters about that, then we better get in there and argue about it and help them to see that there is another way of living as one human family. After Selma, Orloff Miller served in parish ministry in Colorado and California. He helped organize peaceful resistance to the Vietnam War, refused to pay taxes in support of the war, and assisted young people in resisting the draft. Now, the issue of military service is complex, and I'm glad that John Cody held up stories in his reflection today of those who felt morally compelled to serve. Our tradition has stories of proud and faithful military service alongside pacifism and anti-war activism and organizing for peace. We have always grappled with these issues and will continue to do so. Well, in 1979 in San Francisco, Miller came face to face with an epidemic that was claiming the lives of young gay men. He became deeply involved in hospice work during the AIDS crisis. In these early days, there was little to no support for this work, which at the time, Kathleen Parker says, did not fall into any recognized category of UU ministry. Most UUs at the time, echoing the larger societal response, were deeply fearful of the disease and of getting too close to its victims. Since there was no funding for this ministry, Miller supported himself by driving a taxi and doing word processing. His individual work called him to a larger institutional response, and he began touring the country in support of the AIDS Interfaith Network, trying to raise awareness and organize support. He served on the AIDS Working Action Group of the UUA and the AIDS Task Force of the National Council of Churches. The personal toll of working amidst so much death and the loss of so many friends to the disease landed heavily on him. He ultimately retired to Europe, where he worked for the International Council of Unitarian Universalists, and he died in 2015. As an aside, the story of the UU response to AIDS seems to me to be an extremely important story not yet fully told. AIDS ministry was one of the hardest ministries for anyone to undertake. There were many UU churches that did exemplary work during that time, All Souls in New York City for just one example. And there were many that did the work in isolation, lacking support and understanding. There are certainly stories of UUI members engaged in long and faithful service during the AIDS epidemic and after, and I don't have permission to tell those stories in this service, but I would like to tell the story of UUI's response to AIDS in another service. So if you have a story related to AIDS ministry, to UUI's response, or your own personal work during that era, I'd love to talk to you, and you can email me at ministry@uui.org. But there are innumerable stories of UUs making a difference in the world. I know just from having the privilege of talking to you all, how fully the members of this congregation embody this spirit of Unitarian Universalism in your individual lives. You show care and kindness in your interactions with one another. You care for this community, and you are actively engaged in caring for the larger community and the world in many, many different ways. You have led and are leading lives of service in ways large and small. I hope you are all taking the time to learn one another's stories because they are inspiring. And I hasten to add, our ability to serve, to be outwardly focused in our expression of love and energy, can vary considerably at different times in our lives and in our different circumstances. Sometimes we need to be inward focused. Sometimes our focus and our energy is on ourselves or our family, and that is where it needs to be, and that is okay. We are all facing heightened stress right now. We are all experiencing collective trauma. We are all navigating difficult decisions and unfamiliar risks. Our young families with children are facing really difficult decisions right now and need our support. Our teachers are facing really difficult decisions right now and need our support. Our essential workers and medical workers have been in the middle of it all along and need our support. Our young people are in the streets, putting their bodies on the line and need our support. I could go on and on. We are all in it. We are all feeling it. And that's why we live out this religion in community, so we can be there for each other, so we can support one another, and so that our collective commitment can be faithful and consistent. So I can be there when you can't, and vice versa. We stand in the gap, we wheel into the gap, we rest in the gap between our dreams for the world and the reality of the world, and we do what we can. We do what it is given to us to do, and we do it together. At Selma, UUs were together. In our AIDS ministry, we were too often apart, and the people doing the work suffered for it. Well, right now, we are at one of those moments in history where the need for us to do this work and do it together is unusually great, because the world needs our vision so much right now. The world needs people who will work for justice and work for peace and work for our collective liberation and do it grounded in love and compassion and do it faithfully. The world needs us. Not to put too fine a point on it, the world needs you. Service looks like different things at different times. There's an election coming up. Maybe you heard. This is a critical time for us all to make our values of love, justice, and inclusion real in the world. The Unitarian Universalist Association has created a campaign called UU the Vote to organize and encourage our congregations to show up in this historic moment, to register people, to remind people, to write emails and postcards, to get people to the polls, to lift up our UU values and make sure they play their part in shaping the election, to make sure we are heard in the national conversation. In response, UUI will be engaging in its own UU the Vote campaign. This campaign will look like many different things with many different tasks, large and small. We will need leaders, people to organize those many tasks, large and small. And if you are one of those people, please email me at ministry@uui.org. And we will need volunteers, people to do those tasks. And if that is you, look for opportunities in your e-blast. We will need each other. We need each other to do the work we are called to do. We need each other for this congregation to live up to its potential as a beacon in the community and a force for justice in these times. We need each other to thrive. May we live into this moment in such a powerful way that the next generation of UUs facing their own challenges that we can't even imagine look back at us and say, they showed up faithful to the task. They did what they were called to do. They did it together, and so shall we. May it be so, and amen.